So in my Angular apps, typically when I receive data from the server, it will look something like this, where I have things like date timestamps being translated as UTC milliseconds. And I do this because in our database, as is the de facto standard, all date timestamps are stored in the UTC time zone, but when we go to render date time values for the client, we want the data to be in the client's local time zone, and we can use the UTC milliseconds to translate those date objects. Now, because of that, I have to, on the client side, generate human-friendly date strings based on these values. Plus, I might have to derive other data. For example, I have a due date here, and maybe I want to determine whether a given task is overdue, that is, whether the due date is older than the current timestamp. A pattern that I've been using lately is to use JavaScript objects to generate and index derived data. So if we jump up to the top of our controller here, what we'll see is that I have a tasks view model, and this build demo task was the function we were just looking at. And then I have some derived data sets. I have a sorted tasks, a date translations, and an overdue flags. The sorted tasks is just a wrapper around this array to allow us to sort it using mutation and leaving the underlying tasks intact. And then the date translations and overdue flags are our JavaScript objects that are going to act as indices for our derived data. And you'll see that anytime I update the underlying raw data, the underlying tasks view model, I then call these setter methods, which recalculate our derived data and repopulate these indexes. So let's just take a look at the set date translations. And you'll see, get rid of the word wrap, you'll see that what I'm doing is I'm taking the underlying view model for tasks, iterating over it, and then using the date translations object, I'm indexing it based on the raw data. So in this case, I'm indexing based on the created at and due at UTC milliseconds. And then the value of that key is the human-friendly, human-readable date time string. And similarly, if we jump back up to the top again, you can see that I'm calling this set overdue flags. And if we jump down to that, it's using a similar technique where I iterate over the underlying view model for tasks, and then I populate this overdue flags object using the task ID, and then it's a Boolean value determining whether or not that given task is overdue, essentially whether or not the due date is in the past. And now what this allows me to do is use this overdue flags and these date translation objects as simple key value stores that I can use to access the derived data when I'm rendering my Angular template. So if we jump up here to the HTML template, you can see I'm iterating over my sorted tasks. I can output the task description. In this case, the description is just a native property of that task object. But when we get down here into our meta objects, we can see that I'm using those lookup values. So the created at, I'm going to take the task created at UTC milliseconds, and I'm going to use that to look up the human-friendly time string. Similarly, I'm doing that with the due at. Now, when I want to mark a task as overdue, all I have to do is take that native task ID property and see if it exists or returns a Boolean true in that overdue flags lookup. So again, both these date translations and these overdue flags are JavaScript objects that are acting as key value indices that map the raw view model onto our derived view model. And if we go ahead and run this in the browser, you can see that here I'm outputting my created date and my due dates, again using that date translations object. And then here you can see I'm outputting this as overdue, and that's using that overdue flags lookup object. Now I can add a task like tell dog she is the best, and you'll see that we get our task added here, and we also have now our date translations. Now the date translations work because essentially all we have to do is rerun our derived data set calculations anytime the underlying view model changes. So if we jump back into the code here and we look at our form, you can see the form calls add task, and if we jump down to that implementation, what you can see is that I'm taking that view model for task and I'm pushing in a new task, And in this case, the created at and the due date are just UTC milliseconds, the same way as if they would come back from the server. We don't have a server in this case, so we're just going to use some simple data here. And then because I've changed the underlying view model for tasks, all I have to do is rerun my derived data calculations. So I'm going to update the sorted task collection. I'm going to update and repopulate the date translations, and I'm going to update and repopulate the overdue flags. Now this is a little bit brute force, but it's also dead simple. And it means that I can quickly recalculate all of my derived data anytime my underlying view model changes, and all of the data in the template is just implicitly kept up to sync once we make those calculations. So this is a technique that I've been using quite heavily lately, and I've just found it makes managing the view model and managing the Angular templates super simple. And to be honest, I'm borrowing a little bit heavily here from React. I don't personally like React as my framework of choice, but I do appreciate the fact that React errs on the side of recalculating data all the time. They do it in their renderings typically, and I only really need to do it when the view model changes, but this is essentially the same idea. I'm just recalculating data anytime the underlying view model changes, and then it's just simple lookups, and using the object, the JavaScript object, makes that basically a super simple task. So anyway, I just thought I would share. Again, I've been using this very heavily lately in our legacy platform that's still in AngularJS, but the same principles would apply to modern Angular as well. And this is definitely something I'm going to be using and continuing to use going forward.